The Valkai had eaten 17 sentient species across 6 star systems. They had never once asked permission, and when the last survivor of the Thessian homeworld was dragged aboard the Galactic Council's diplomatic vessel, bloody, barely breathing, clutching a translator device in one hand and a crumpled photograph in the other, every alien delegate leaned forward to watch him die. He didn't. His name was Corporal Dario Vasquez, 5 feet 8 inches tall, 170 pounds, brown eyes that hadn't slept properly in 11 days, a hairline fracture in his left arm that he hadn't reported because there hadn't been time, and frankly, there hadn't been anyone left to report it to. He was the sole human representative aboard the Conclave of 17, the most powerful diplomatic assembly in the known galaxy, and he had arrived 3 hours late, covered in someone else's blood, carrying nothing except a dead soldier's photograph and the absolute refusal to show anyone how terrified he was. The chamber was staggering in its scale. A rotating ring station the size of a small moon, its interior carved into a massive amphitheater where 17 alien species sat in tiered galleries, each delegation separated by atmospheric bubbles tuned to their specific biological needs. Some breathed methane, some breathed nothing at all. The Orathi delegates floated in pressurized liquid tanks, their bioluminescent skin flickering with what the translator rendered as mild contempt. Dario walked to the center platform and looked up at all of them. He had met aliens before. Every human soldier had by that point in the war. But there was something different about seeing them assembled like this. Hundreds of representatives from hundreds of worlds, every single one of them older than human civilization, every single one of them watching the small mammal from the third planet of an unremarkable star, with expressions that ranged from pity to amusement. Ambassador Valthaxis of the Shurian Collective spoke first. His voice came through the translator as silk over gravel, beautiful and slightly threatening, the way expensive things sometimes are. We were told the human delegation would include a senior diplomatic envoy, a military attaché, and a cultural liaison. Dario looked up at him. "They're dead," he said. The chamber went very quiet. "The Valkai reached our transport 3 days outside the Thessian debris field." Ambassador Chen made it to an escape pod. Lieutenant Akafer got the distress beacon running. Specialist Rays, he stopped, looked at the photograph in his hand, folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. "I'm what made it," he said, "so, let's talk." In the Shurian language, the word that Valthaxis used in that moment translated loosely as insignificant. He didn't bother to lower his voice. Several delegates laughed, a sound like wind chimes and breaking glass, depending on the species. They thought this was already over. They had never been more wrong about anything in their long, ancient, sophisticated lives. Here is what the Conclave of 17 knew about humanity in the year 2387. Earth had achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 60 years prior, embarrassingly recent, by galactic standards. The Shurian Collective had been spacefaring for 11,000 years. The Orathi had seeded 3 star systems with life before humanity had discovered fire. Humans were new. Humans were small. Humans were, by every biological metric the Galactic Science Assembly had published, remarkably fragile. No natural armor, no venom, poor night vision, distressingly short lifespans. They slept for 8 hours out of every 24, a vulnerability so extreme that several species had initially assumed it was a negotiating tactic. They had one planet, one moon, a handful of struggling colonies, and somehow, improbably, maddeningly, they had survived their first contact with the Valkai. That last part kept certain people up at night. Metaphorically speaking, the Valkai didn't sleep either. The Valkai, just saying the name in certain parts of the galaxy caused atmospheric processors to register a spike in stress pheromones. They were 8 feet of apex predator wrapped in carbon lattice exoskeleton, a species that had evolved on a planet with 17 competing apex predators and had killed every single one of them before developing spaceflight. They thought in terms of territory. They communicated in terms of dominance. Their concept of diplomacy was allowing the other party to choose which limb they surrendered first. They had never been stopped. not by the Shurian fleet, not by the Orathi collective consciousness, not by the Thessian alliance, which had once fielded the largest military force in the quadrant and now existed only as a debris field and a trauma response. And then humanity had stepped into Valkai space. Not intentionally, their navigation was still embarrassingly imprecise, and had survived the encounter. No one knew how, no one had asked. And for 60 years, the galaxy had collectively decided that this was probably a coincidence, because the alternative was unsettling in ways that none of them had adequate language to express. The purpose of this session was simple as extinction ever is. The Valkai were moving again. They had consumed the Thessian homeworld in 11 days. 11 days for a civilization of 4 billion people, a species that had been building starships when humans were drawing on cave walls. And now the Valkai fleet was turning, repositioning. The navigational projections were already complete. They were heading for human space. The conclave had convened to decide whether to issue a formal warning to Earth, not to help, not to intervene, simply to warn, and even that was proving controversial. Ambassador Valthaxis had laid the argument out with the graceful ruthlessness of someone who had been in politics for 3 centuries. The warning would imply obligation. Obligation would create precedent. Precedent might eventually suggest that the conclave had responsibility, and responsibility toward a 60-year-old spacefaring species with 1 planet, and a handful of colonies, and a biological need to sleep 8 hours a night, was not something the Shurian collective had any interest in establishing. Better to let it happen. Better to let the Valkai have their meal, and then, perhaps, negotiate new territorial boundaries from a position of safety. Better to be silent. Dario had listened to 4 hours of this. He had listened with his hands folded on the table in front of him, his broken arm aching in a way he refused to acknowledge, his eyes moving from delegate to delegate with an expression that the Orathi cultural analysts would later describe as disturbingly unreadable for a mammalian species. When Valthaxis finally called for the preliminary vote, Dario raised his hand. Corporal Vasquez, the ambassador said, and even the translator caught the condescension. Humans have observer status only at this conclave. You have no vote. I know, Dario said. I have a question. The chamber settled into the specific silence of people who are tolerating something. How many of you have met a Valkai? He asked. In person, face to face. The silence changed texture. Because I have, he said, 3 times. And I'd like to tell you about the 3rd time if you'll allow me, because I think it's relevant to what you're deciding. Valthaxis looked like he was calculating how rude he could afford to be. You have 5 minutes, he said finally. Dario nodded. I'll only need 3, he said, and then he told them. The first time Dario Vasquez had met a Valkai, he was 22 years old, and the encounter lasted approximately 4 seconds before his entire squad opened fire, and the Valkai in question decided that this particular canyon wasn't worth the trouble. The second time, he was 26, on the mining colony of Prospect Station, and he had spent 11 hours barricaded in a processing facility with 37 civilians and a Valkai that had gotten separated from its hunting party. That story ended with everyone alive, including the Valkai, and a commendation from his commanding officer that used the phrase inexplicable outcome 4 times in 3 paragraphs. The 3rd time was 3 weeks ago. He had been on Thessia Prime when the fleet arrived. He had been there as part of a humanitarian assessment. Earth had been quietly providing the Thessians with medical technology and agricultural support for a decade, a fact that the conclave had been pointedly uninterested in, and when the Valkai came, he had done what his training told him to do. He had started getting people out. Not soldiers, not diplomats, people. Children from a school near the eastern settlement, medical staff from a field hospital. An elderly Thessian historian named Kale Voss who had refused to leave his archive until Dario had personally carried 40 years of irreplaceable research onto a transport ship, and informed him that the research was now safe, so could he please move. For 6 days, Dario had run those streets. He had no fleet. He had no reinforcements. He had a squad of 8 soldiers, a handful of Thessian volunteers, and a transport ship that was never designed for what they were asking it to do. He had improvised, he had adapted. He had done things with thermal detonators and municipal water systems that his engineering instructor would have called creative, and his mother would have called please don't tell me. On the fifth day, a Valkai found him, not a patrol, not a scout. The commander, the Dario paused in his story. The chamber was perfectly silent. Her name, he said slowly in their language, translated to something like, she who has broken the spines of mountains. I know. They named themselves dramatically. A few delegates made sounds that might have been laughter but quieter than before. She had been watching us for 2 days, Dario said. I didn't know that until she told me. She had been watching us pull people out of burning buildings, and I didn't know she was there because... He stopped, swallowed. Because she wasn't attacking, he said. She was watching. And on the fifth day, she stepped out of the wreckage and she stood in front of me, 8 feet of the most dangerous thing I've ever seen in my life, and I thought, this is it. This is where it ends. He looked at his hands. She didn't attack me, he said quietly. She stood there for a very long time, and then she said in her own language, my translator almost couldn't parse it, she said, you run toward the dying, you are not prey, you are something else. The chamber had forgotten to breathe. And then she walked away, Dario said, and her fleet held position for 18 hours. 18 hours where they could have been finishing what they started. Instead, they held, and we got another 4,000 people off that planet. He looked up at Valkai. I don't know why, he said. I'm not going to pretend I understand what happens inside a Valkai's head, but I know what happened. And I know this. You are sitting here deciding whether to warn 8 billion people that something is coming for them. And you're worried about precedent, about obligation, about what it might cost you to say 2 words to a species that has been quietly, without asking for credit, without asking for anything, pulling people out of burning buildings in a war that was never theirs. He stood up. 8 billion people, he said. That's a lot of people who run toward the dying. He sat back down. In the gallery above him, the Orathi delegates were doing something with their bioluminescence that their cultural liaison would later identify as the Orathi equivalent of stunned silence. Valkai was very still. That, the ambassador said carefully, is an interesting account, but it doesn't. And then the emergency alarm went off. The Valkai fleet dropped out of dark transit directly outside the station's exclusion zone, not attacking, just a present. 300 warships arranged in a formation that every military analyst in the chamber recognized as a herald configuration, the Valkai equivalent of a formal arrival. A declaration, not of war, of audience. Every delegate started talking at once. Emergency protocols activated. 3 of the methane breathers had to be physically restrained by their own staff. The Orathi tanks began cycling through colors so rapidly that their translators simply rendered it as untranslatable emotional state. And then a single Valkai ship separated from the fleet. It broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. What came through the translators wasn't a threat. It was a name. Dario Vasquez of the pale blue world. The voice said, a voice like tectonic plates grinding together, like the last sound a mountain makes before it falls. She who has broken the spines of mountains sends word. Dario stood very slowly. Every eye in the chamber was on him. She says, the small one who runs toward the dying, is he among the cowards who would decide his fate without him? The silence that fell over the conclave of 17 was the kind of silence that gets recorded in historical archives. Valkai turned to look at Dario with an expression that his species only made in the presence of something they fundamentally hadn't predicted, hadn't prepared for, and weren't entirely sure they had the framework to understand. You know her, he said. It wasn't a question. I told you, Dario said quietly. 3rd time. She came here for you. Dario was already moving toward the communications array. No, he said. She came here for the same reason I did. He reached the array. Opened a channel. She who has broken the spines of mountains, he said. This is Vasquez. I'm here. What do you need? The response was immediate. The galaxy decides whether to warn your people, the Valkai commander said. We have heard their deliberations. We came to tell them something they do not know. Dario's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What don't they know? He asked. And what she who had broken the spines of mountains said next rewrote 60 years of galactic history in approximately 40 seconds. She had been there. 11 years ago, when Dario was 26 and barricaded in a processing facility with 37 civilians and a separated Valkai. That Valkai had been her second born. She had been hunting that system with her family, a concept that the conclave delegates were struggling to process, because the accepted galactic understanding was that Valkai didn't have families, they had territorial units, and her second born had gotten separated during a patrol, and then a mining colony's emergency lockdown had trapped him inside a human facility. Standard Valkai protocol for this situation was simple. The facility burns. The second-born fights free or perishes honorably. She had given the order. She had watched through orbital sensors as the facility held, as her second-born remained contained. As impossibly the situation did not resolve the way Valkai situations always resolved, for 11 hours, and then the facility doors had opened, and her second-born had walked out, alive, uninjured, moving with a strange, unfamiliar quality that it took her 3 days to identify, because she had never seen it before in a context like this. He was moving like he wasn't afraid, not the fearlessness of dominance, not the absence of fear that comes from certainty of victory, something else, the kind of calm that comes from having been seen, from having been, against all reason and instinct and self-interest, treated as something worth preserving. A human, one specific human, 26 years old, running on no sleep and nothing but stubbornness, and the apparently unshakable conviction that everyone in that building was going to make it out, had spent 11 hours finding a way to communicate with a creature who had no reason to let him live, had kept 37 civilians from panicking, had jury-rigged a translation matrix from mining equipment and a personal communicator, had sat across from her second-born in the dark and with the extraordinary human audacity of having absolutely nothing to offer, had offered companionship anyway. When the doors opened, the Valkai had walked past Dario without attacking him. She had given the order to stand down. The Valkai fleet had left the system. And she who had broken the spines of mountains had done something that had no Valkai word for it, something that her species had not done in the 30,000 years of their recorded existence. She had followed someone, quietly, from a distance, watching. For 11 years she had tracked the small human from the mining colony, had watched him operate in crisis after crisis, had watched him run toward fires that everyone else was running from, had watched him pull the injured from wreckage and negotiate with hostile parties and sleep on cold ground next to people who were frightened, so that they would know they weren't alone. She had been on Thessia Prime because he was on Thessia Prime, and what she had seen him do for 6 days in those burning streets had led her to a conclusion so unprecedented, so structurally strange to her species' way of thinking, that she had spent 3 weeks in deliberation before deciding to act on it. Dario Vasquez was not prey. He was not an enemy. He was not an ally in any framework her people had language for. He was something the Valkai had been searching for, across 30,000 years of conquest and consumption and territorial expansion, without ever knowing they were searching. He was something they recognized. In our oldest stories, she said, her voice resonating through every speaker in the chamber, before the first wars, before the spines of the first mountains broke, we had a word. We stopped using it. We thought what it described was gone. The translation came through with a single word, brother. The conclave of 17 sat in absolute total galaxy reconfiguring silence. Valthaxis was the first to find words. You are, he said slowly to Dario, aware that what you are hearing is unprecedented. I'm getting that sense, Dario said. His voice was very steady. His hands under the table were not. He was 29% sure he was in shock and 81% sure this was not the time to deal with that. The Valkai have declared kinship, Valthaxis continued, with a human, with humanity. She who had broken the spines of mountains corrected, her voice cutting through the chamber like a geological event. What one of them is, all of them are. This is what we have learned. This is what you have not understood. She paused. When my second born was contained, he was prey. The human could have let him die. He had every tactical reason to let him die. He chose otherwise. When I watched the small one on Thessia, he had every reason to run. He chose otherwise. When he stood in these chambers and spoke of his dead friends without breaking in front of those who would decide his people's fate with the same weight they give to selecting a meal, he had every reason to break. A long beat. He chose otherwise. "We know what we are," she said. "We are conquest. We are hunger. We are the ending of things. But even we remember that there was a time before the hunger, and in that time we knew what to call something that stands in the fire for others. Something that protects the small and the frightened, not because it is ordered to, not because it profits, but because it cannot imagine doing otherwise." "Brother," she said again. "We call it brother. The Valkai will not move on human space." The chamber erupted, not in celebration. In a kind of stunned, gasping chaos that 17 different species expressed in 17 different ways, but which all translated to the same fundamental state. The world just changed, and none of us have caught up yet. 300 Valkai warships sat outside the station like a promise, like a boundary, like a wall around something they had decided was worth protecting. Dario sat in the center of all of it and stared at the communications array and said nothing for a very long time. Then he reached into his breast pocket. He took out the folded photograph. Specialist Elena Reyes, 24 years old, second-generation colonist, laughing at something off camera in a way that made everyone around her laugh too, every single time without fail, like it was a superpower. He looked at it for a long moment. "You'd have loved this, Reyes," he said quietly. "You'd have absolutely loved this." The vote, when it finally happened, was unanimous, not for a warning. The conclave of 17 issued Earth a formal offer of membership, something that had never been extended to a species with less than 500 years of spaceflight. The debates that followed lasted 6 months and generated more legislative documentation than the previous decade combined. She who had broken the spines of mountains returned to her fleet. Before she went, she spoke one final time on the open channel. "The cowards in that chamber will try to use you," she said. "They will give you their membership and their treaties and their handshakes, and they will expect that this makes you theirs. Be careful of that. Ones who run toward the dying are rare. The galaxy will want to spend that rarity." A pause. "If they try to spend you past what is right, call our name. We will hear it." And 300 Valkai warships turned and disappeared into dark transit. The galaxy watched them go. And then the galaxy turned to look at humanity, tiny, fragile, 60 years spacefaring, sleeping 8 hours a night, one planet humanity, with eyes that had fundamentally reassigned their categories. Not prey, not primitive, not insignificant. Something the oldest predators in the known universe had recognized when sophisticated civilizations 11,000 years their senior had not. Something that ran toward the dying. Something that sat in the dark with the frightened and offered company it had no tactical reason to offer. Something that folded a photograph carefully, said a name quietly, and kept moving. The conclave of 17 had convened to decide whether to warn 8 billion people. They had walked out understanding that those 8 billion people might be the most important thing in the galaxy. Not because of their weapons, not because of their fleet, because of what they did when there was nothing to gain and everything to lose. Because of what they chose, every time, against every reason, in every burning building and debris field and crumbling street. They chose otherwise. Years later, when young Valkai were taught the history of the Great Turning, the moment their people stepped back from eternal conquest, they were not shown maps or fleet formations or political treaties. They were shown a photograph, a human soldier laughing, and beneath it, in Valkai script so old it had no modern translation, a single word: brother.